我们上一个视频介绍了萨克斯一针见血地指出，美国作为一个超级大国，目前在全球所起了非常不好的作用，将世界搞得一团糟。我这种一边和大家一起看视频，一边说一下我知道的某些背景，让大家能够更明白他说的是什么意思。毕竟国际经济和政治的事儿啊，没有背景知识是很难理解的，甚至完全相反都有可能的。如果有些网友英语听力很好，而且喜欢看原汁原味的，其实你完全可以在网上找到原视频去看的啊，很容易找到的。这里的字幕呢，也是我们经过理解后的产物。如果可能影响你，真的建议你去看原视频啊。如果你没有这方面的能力，那你还是听我慢慢的，一段一段的。我觉得合适的地方停下来，然后告诉你我听完这段想说的。如果这一段你也有想说的，可以用弹幕告诉我。看完整段视频有想说的，那你可以在下面的评论区发表你的看法。好，我们切入正题。这一段呢，他从乌克兰战争开始说起。我们先听听他怎么说的，然后再说说我不吐不快的事儿。
Great. Let me start with the decarbonization. The decarbonization did not cause the rise of energy prices in the last 6 months. This is caused by not mainly the war in Ukraine, but by the sanctions that were put in response to the war. There is actually no physical shortage of oil and gas. Europe decided not to buy. That's it. Full stop. This was on some strategy that this would bring the Russian economy to its knees. I wrote repeatedly from the beginning that that was foolish. Things don't work that way. And this was not going to succeed. And it hasn't succeeded. So this is an own goal. Sorry. That's not how this is going to be ended by Europe not buying oil and gas from Russia.
做一个演讲，特别是言之有物的演讲啊，他首先给大家介绍了一下背景，让大家能够理解后面说的事儿，这是非常重要的，言简意赅，清晰地表达了自己的观点。欧洲不从俄罗斯购买石油和天然气是相当愚蠢的做法。
Russia has alternatives. It's making a fortune at higher prices. The world is not exactly backing these sanctions. The sanctions are backed by about 15% of the world population. That is the NATO region. The rest of the world shrugs their shoulders. Don't get us involved. Thank you very much.
这一点呢，就是许多西方社会的民众误解的地方啊。他们以为制裁俄罗斯啊是全球大多数人的选择，是一个共识，而且是站在正义的一方。萨克斯用数据告诉我们，只有15%的人支持制裁俄罗斯，也就是北约的这些小喽啰的国家，对吧？但他们的话也只是叫得欢而已，实际上一个个又做不到。从乌克兰战争以来，这些国家在各种媒体都发表一些什么全球能源问题与乌克兰战争之间的关联。我看的最多的是 Nature 和 Science， 连这些顶级科学杂志都无法幸免，总是喜欢讨论这种从意识形态出发的问题。其他的呢就可想而知了，我们就看看 Nature 近几个月的吧，大家只要看看题目就行了啊，内容啊真的不值得一看。这第一个呢就代表了全世界，我们刚才看到了。其实也就是15%而已。这第二个呢，以这些传染病关联起来，这话说的似乎英国、美国的新冠肺炎已经结束了似的啊。不过他们也确实结束了啊。然后乌克兰战争对能源、气候和粮食的影响。再下一个 ，OK， 你们如果认为暴露了研究中的空白啊，这估计是唯一看得下去的一篇文章了。俄罗斯在乌克兰的战争扰乱了对古生物的研究。其实啊，我觉得更担心的是现代生物的研究，特别是人。相比这些事儿，古代生物的研究有那么重要吗？至少古生物也不会得什么新冠了。最后呢，还可以喊一下口号啊， 但欧洲绝不能在气候行动上倒退。其实俄罗斯啊，也不希望你们在气候行动上倒退。
So this is not about decarbonization. This is about a sanctions regime. I would not have followed this route. I would not have recommended that Europe put itself into a recession out of this route. I would have asked the question, is this likely to be effective? The answer is no. I would not have let the people that were so gung-ho about the war shout that down, which they did, and say, if you continue to buy, you're funding the Russian war machine and a lot of other things. Rather, I would have gone to negotiate from even before the start of the war. This is about the United States and Russia not negotiating over NATO enlargement. That's why we have the war this year. And we have the high prices because of sanctions that were put on by us that are not going to change the outcome of this war. So if we have more thought on this, we will do better. The decarbonization agenda is not a 6-month agenda. It is a 30-year agenda. It has to be pursued step by step.
这里说的30年的议程，在我们中国呢称为碳中和。欧美发达国家将碳中和的曲线设定在2050年，而我们是发展中国家，所以我们给自己设定的时间呢是2060年。从过去的许多经验来看，其他国家有些可能只是说说而已，不一定真能办到。特别是现在有了乌克兰战争，还不知道什么时候结束。他们发誓拒绝购买俄罗斯的石油，准备重新烧煤炭和柴火了。那么离目标呢，可能就越来越远了。因为煤炭是最脏的能源，也就是碳排最高的。这用掉的份额啊，都会算在你们头上。到时候的话，你们还是要吸收回来的。而我们设定的2060年呢，是打算说到做到的啊。不过在这个问题上呢，萨克斯也充分肯定了中国，但还是建议我们国家将碳中和年限提前到2050年。这样在国际社会上可能受到的压力要小一些。未来呢还有不到30年的时间，我们拭目以待。这后面呢，他就在与我们大家讨论有关碳中和的策略的问题。他不是病毒学家，但是他在 PLOS 上与其他人合作发表了一篇讨论新冠病毒的文章，就是我们在之前的视频中给大家介绍的那篇文章。在 PLOS 上发表文章呢，你不承认他是专家都不行啊！而且他之前呢还被医学杂志《纽约刀》邀请为新冠委员会的主席，这又说明了什么呢？有人看到他现在的头衔呢是经济学家，就认定他不是专家。但是你是否知道，他2000年左右啊就主持了世卫组织宏观经济与健康委员会的工作，之后还担任过哥伦比亚大学地球研究所的所长。有人看到他是经济学家，就说他是外行。那么究竟谁是外行呢？这下面谈到的有关碳中和及其新能源体系的设想，还有上个视频中谈到的气候变化的问题啊，再看看他之前的一些背景，我们大多数人啊根本就没有资格说他是外行。其实吧，我们还是应该相信啊，人与人是有差异的。有的人呢，一辈子就学了一个专业，就关注过一个领域的事儿，但一开口仍然像是外行。而另外一些人呢，他们可以同时涉足好几个专业，居然可以每个专业都了解得很透彻，能进行专家级别的对话。所以我特别不喜欢大家用贴标签的方式来轻易肯定或者是否定一个人的说法是否靠谱。关键是你能够具体指出他的问题在哪儿嘛？哪怕你只是根据具体的事实提出了疑问或者是质疑也可以啊。
The most important two things are to build the zero carbon energy system. This is the core, zero carbon power. Wind, solar, hydro, in Europe, some nuclear with France. And second, to build an interconnected grid. Because with an intermittent energy system, you need interconnection. And by the way, we need interconnection between the North Sea and the Black Sea. It's interesting, they are what's called a dipole of wind.
这里的 dipole of wind 我不知道如何翻译啊，暂时翻译为风偶极子吧。 意思大概就是风力发电可以接力，也可以说成是像跷跷板一样的此起彼伏。它后面进行了更详细的解释，但它的表达中呢有一些口误，我根据上下文在译文当中进行了修正，也进行了标注。大家看到那里的时候呢，请注意一下啊。
So when it's windy in one place, it's still in the other. When it's still in the other place, it's windy in the first, and so on. So if you connect the North Sea and the Black Sea, you have nice, smooth wind power. So we want a grid that is interconnected and a lot of investment in zero carbon power. What does zero carbon power do? It propels our vehicles in the future. It, of course, heats and cools our buildings. It is core to electrification of a lot of current dirty industry. And it will be the basis of producing hydrogen, which will be used for ocean transport and for some other heavy industrial processes and metallurgy, especially steel making. So the roadmap technologically is known. You have great companies like Iberdrola and others that know how to do this transformation. And we need investment, not in 6 months and not blaming the war. We need investments over the next 25 or 30 years.
这里就再次强调，我们的当务之急是什么？我们是否应该把主要精力放在最重要的事上？但目前并非如此。原因是什么呢？
Why isn't this happening systematically? Mainly because the fossil fuel industry has always been politically powerful for the last century. And it's been powerful, by the way, since James Watt invented the steam engine. And the hydrocarbon sector, the oil and gas sector, became the most powerful lobby in the world after Churchill decided to shift the British fleet from coal to oil. And that made that sector crucial. And so we have a political challenge. My country is a petrostate, the same way that Russia is a petrostate. The chairman of our Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, buckle your seatbelts, owns 2 coal companies. So what is his mission in life, Senator Joe Manchin? It's to stop all climate legislation. In a sting filming of a lobbyist who thought he was doing a job interview but was actually spilling the beans about how ExxonMobil lobbies, they called Senator Joe Manchin the kingmaker of the Congress because ExxonMobil could always turn to the kingmaker.
好，到这里呢，不知道大家是否清楚了？资本主义国家，资本的力量是名副其实的强大呀。所有的一切都是为资本服务的，那些政客们啊，只不过是前台的牵线木偶而已。
Well, this was news for about 10 seconds in America. Why? Because American politics is so corrupt. That doesn't make news. He wasn't asked to step down from the Senate committee. He wasn't asked anything about it. Because if you say there's corruption in America, they say, well, duh. You know, well, what do you think? You got a PhD to know that? So we have a political system that costs about $15 billion per election cycle right now. You think it's the poor people paying for the elections? No.
看到了吧？说美国政治太腐败，都不会成为新闻，因为这是大家都知道的事儿，怎么可能有人关心呢？那么之前还有人问我，他为啥没获得诺贝尔和平奖啊？哎，我觉得你现在应该能解释了吧？他后面会继续谈论资本是用来干什么的。
So this is why we don't get consequent action. The US Senate hasn't voted one piece of climate legislation since ratifying the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992. Not a single major piece of climate legislation, tiny things, but nothing significant because the system is so corrupt. And so that's the US. There's Saudi, there's Russia, there's Australia, there is all of the countries that have fossil fuels are crazy. you're just a little crazy because you just have a little bit left. And I mean, it makes it hard politically. If you have a lot, it's almost impossible to think straight. And to show how blind we are, like King Midas, like the myths, here we've discovered some hydrocarbons in the Eastern Mediterranean. First of all, do we need those hydrocarbons? God, no. We have more hydrocarbons than we could ever safely burn. But look who's going crazy over this. Turkey versus Greece versus Cyprus versus Israel versus Egypt. Everybody's scrambling for this new deposit of hydrocarbons that should be left under the sea. Thank you very much. There's no use for it at all. So this is our problem. We don't think straight. We don't plan properly. Our politics are corrupted. That's been an problem. And what we need is a program for the next 25 years, but we should not confuse the war and decarbonization. And we should not blame decarbonization at all for anything that's happening right now. It has nothing to do with anything that's happening right now. Not at all.
因为前面我给大家介绍了 Nature 和 Science 上的文章在讨论一些什么问题，大家就可以理解他这里所说的我们不应该把战争和脱碳混为一谈，不应该把现在发生的所有的事儿都归咎于脱碳。如果刚才说的这些事儿你觉得有些费解的话，那么他后面将要讨论的去全球化的问题，我相信大家都有切身感受的，而且我将这个点呢作为他本段演讲的主题。
On the question of deglobalization, there are profoundly deep reasons for globalization. For me, the deepest reason is that I like coffee in the morning, and it does not grow in Central Park, where I live. So I want Guatemalan coffee or Indonesian coffee or Ethiopian coffee in the morning. I really want it. And I can't have it without globalization. And there are about 10 million products like that. And by the way, I like to come visit Madrid. That's globalization. And other people like to come visit as well. And I like other cultures too, because the world, maybe since the Tower of Babel, has had different cultures, different languages, different vantage points in the world. It's a beautiful part of living.
他用最通俗的话诠释了什么是全球化，求同存异，现代生活的许多美好都源于全球化。
I really like Chinese culture, and it goes back 3,000 years, and it's beautiful, and I want to know more about it, and I want to go visit Xi'an, and I want to go visit different places. That's globalization. And I want my students to be from these countries and go home to these countries, and I want to go give guest lectures in these countries, because that's a wonderful part of life.
任何时候说到全球化，如果没有中国的参与，那是毫无意义的。所以这里呢，就特别强调他对中国的认识，大家是不是觉得特别的亲切？
So what are we talking about? Now, that has all been made stronger by technology, because the technology of globalization is transport and communications. That's what connects us. So we now have the most effective transport and communications imaginable in the history of humanity.
Yeah.
And we should be globalizing every moment on Zoom and on connections. And I usually have about 10 different meetings in all different parts of the world on an average day, typical day. So even if I'm sitting in my living room, I'm globalized. And that's another wonderful thing. So I think if we measured that chart, not on physical goods and services, but on bytes or bits that are being transmitted, the globalization's off the charts. And so in this sense, we should be much more globalized and enjoying each other's company and each other's products and each other's specialization and each other's innovation. That's a goal.
他这里表达了全球化能够实现，是我们这个时代最重要的特征，也是这个时代的潮流，因为技术发展到了这一步了。
Now, given that globalization has been part of humanity for a long time, I'll plug my recent book called The Ages of Globalization. I argue that globalization is 70,000 years old in different waves of technology. First, it was walking and rafts, and now it is the digital age. Globalization has had setbacks. The worst setback was from 1918 to 1945. That was a disastrous period of deglobalization. So we saw what happens when nationalism comes to the forefront. You end up with economic collapse first, which was the first wave of that period, and then war, which was the second wave. We actually cannot have another world war. I don't know how, if we're going to avoid it, but we're in a different era from all of human history with the nuclear age. So we can't afford such a blunder again. So we have to think completely differently.
他认为全球化一直是人类的一部分，历史上的去全球化是灾难性的，会导致经济崩溃，会导致战争。而现在，在拥有核武器的时代，如果再有类似的错误，可能是极其危险的。
And that makes it very hard. And when I read the stupidest thing that I've read in the last 6 months, and I've read it often, don't let Putin blackmail us with nuclear blackmail. Well, sorry, I take the risk seriously, and so should you. It's not about being blackmailed, it's about knowing that we're in a nuclear age and we should behave ourselves. Because it's a different period. And if you study the nuclear age carefully, which I've tried to do for many, many years, you know how close we've come to the brink several times. And I know about my country, we're led by a lot of stupid people very frequently. And if those stupid people had had their way 60 years ago in the Cuban Missile Crisis, rather than John Kennedy, who saved the world almost single-handedly against his advisors, we would have blown up the world because every one of Kennedy's advisors in the Cuban Missile Crisis said, take out those nukes, because everything they thought they knew about them was false. All CIA intelligence completely wrong. But Kennedy had the good sense that the world depended on him, and he said, we should be cautious, we should be diplomatic, and we should compromise. And he did. You take out your missiles, we'll take out our missiles. The big problem was that at the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, he insisted on keeping the trade secret. So Americans learned the lesson. We won instead of we compromised. Had they known the truth, we might have saved ourselves a lot of grief afterwards because we completely misread the lesson of that crisis. The lesson of the Cuban Missile Crisis was compromise. Compromise is not appeasement. Compromise is saving ourselves. And so, bottom line for me, globalization, we need it. We want it. Could it be stopped? Yes, of course it could be stopped. But it would be a disaster.
不知道大家是否知道啊，萨克斯曾经做过哈佛大学肯尼迪学院国际发展研究所的所长，他对美国总统都有非常认真的研究，所以他说这些话那权威性就可想而知了啊。这一段呢比较容易理解，我的解读呢就到这里。他这段演讲之后呢，后面还有2到3段啊。如果你有兴趣，可以继续用弹幕告诉我，想继续看。谢谢你的关注，我是复旦赵斌，再见。